You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zinno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. As always, we appreciate you joining us each and every week. Before we get to this week's guest, a member of the United States Navy for over 27 years, multiple combat deployments, and a very interesting podcast that's sort of in the same realm of the Hazard Ground. We'll get to that coming up in just a moment, but a few reminders. Please continue the Amazon promotion. It is going very well. You guys are doing an awesome job. Go to our website, hazardground.com. Scroll all the way down to the bottom of the homepage or click on that Amazon button. It'll redirect you to Amazon. You can do all of your normal Amazon shopping, whatever you need to buy, whatever you want to get. Shop away. We'll get a percentage of what you guys spend, and we'll donate a percentage of that back to some of the charities and organizations you've heard featured here on the show. So it's an easy way for you guys to help out veterans charities just by going to hazardground.com first to do all of your Amazon shopping. Again, hazardground.com. Amazon button at the bottom of the homepage. Please continue to leave the Apple reviews. They're coming in fast and furious. We love it. Send more of them. We'll want to put them up on social media. And full disclosure, I know I'm bad about checking our social media sites, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hazard Ground and Hazard Ground Podcast. But I do check it. And I promise I will get back to all of you if you write me. If you got a guest suggestion, go to hazardground.com as well. Click on the contact us button and fill out the form. And that's that's probably the easier way to get in contact with the show. Is just go to the website and do that first. So again, don't forget about our social media sites, Hazard Ground Podcast. Leave Apple reviews and continue to use hazardground.com for your Amazon uses, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Smash the like button, give a thumbs up to all the content there. Just search Hazard Ground on YouTube and you'll get everything you need right there. We appreciate all the love and support. All right, this week's guest is still a current serving member of the United States Navy. He's with over 27 years of service, holding the rank of commander. She currently is the PAO of the maritime branch of NATO, which is crazy because, you know, NATO is a weird place these nowadays. 3 deployments, combat deployments, including one with the Navy SEALs and the Army SF. She holds 2 master's degrees and has a podcast called the SOS Podcast, Stories of Service, much similar to what we do here on the Hazard Ground. She's joining us live from the UK. It is Teresa Carpenter here on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Teresa, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Mark. Very, very kind introduction, and I'm excited to be here and have this conversation. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. And it was kind and true. That was the most important part of it. You and I actually connected on LinkedIn, which as I found is like the veteran space on LinkedIn is crazy. And for people who are listening to this, watching it, if you're not on LinkedIn and get on LinkedIn, just connect in the veteran space. There are so many amazing people there doing so many amazing things in their post-military career. I know there are a lot of people on there who are in the military still, like yourself, and they tread a lot more lightly because of the worries, but you have a very open sort of stance and everything.
I don't necessarily do that. But
well,
yes.
I know, but I know that's kind of what I appreciate about you. I mean, look, it even says change agent on your LinkedIn page, which I think is amazing. And I think the podcast is a big part of that. But I was excited to tell your story because you have a lot of different views than like I do, sort of about the military and where it's gone and what you've done over your career. And it's a very diverse career. So I'm glad that you're here, and I'm glad you're willing to do this.
Awesome. Yeah, I am definitely so excited to be here. And you're right. LinkedIn has opened up so many doors for me personally. I was active on Facebook for a number of years. I had a blog. So I've done online communications for quite a while, even in my personal off-duty life. But LinkedIn has really been that game changer and has connected me to so many more people and allowed me to continue to share not only now my story, but then the stories of others.
No, absolutely. And we'll get to SOS podcast here coming up a little bit, but start at the beginning, 27 years. How and why'd you get in the Navy?
So I'm originally from Columbus, Ohio, which is not an area that's all that familiar with military service, although people there are very patriotic.
Or water for that matter.
Yes. Navy was not anybody's thought when they had in mind when they thought of myself. I grew up in a middle class, I would say upper middle class neighborhood. I went to Catholic private schools. My mom and dad are still together. We live in a very nice older home, and they're actually still in that same home. And when I joined the Navy, I was 19 years old. I had worked a series of low wage, menial jobs And I didn't feel like I was really going anywhere. I had moved out of my mom and dad's house at a pretty young age. The year I turned 17, I spent my senior year in high school actually living on my own, and had just kept kind of going cycling in and out of jobs. I worked at a clothing store. I worked at a restaurant bussing tables. I was a hostess. I even worked for a place called Victoria's Secret Catalog, answering telephone calls through the catalogs back in the day, and then another phone center as well. And at that point, I was frustrated. I was burnt out, and I just thought that there had to be something else out there for me. But I wasn't really keen on understanding myself well enough to know what type of a career I wanted to have. So I was living with a gentleman who was in the Marine Corps Reserves, and he started talking to me about the military. And so I looked at my options at home, not being able to make my ends meet and not being able to pay my debts off because I was spending all my money on the discounted clothing from Victoria's Secret Catalog. And so I ended up visiting a recruiter, and I didn't want to go into the Marines or the Army. I was a little weary of that because I didn't know anything about the military at all anyway. And so I thought, well, Navy is water and I'll get to travel, and that might be kind of cool. But I don't know what I want to do. I don't know who I want to be. I mean, I was really kind of directionless in terms of my career and storytelling. I mean, I never would have thought that I'd end up, where I am today. So I spoke to a recruiter, and he told me about all the travel opportunities, and really kind of got deep with me about what I was really trying to do and why I wanted to better myself. And it was actually kind of one of those heart to heart kind of mentoring recruiters, actually, who took me in the back room, and we just talked and talked and talked. And he said, well, I've got an opportunity for you. He said, I can make you what's called an air crewman. And I didn't know what air crew meant. I didn't know if that was a good deal or a bad deal. I knew it had something to do with aviation. And I never fixed things growing up. I was not a gearhead or any of those things, but I just kind of thought like, gosh, this will get me out of my hometown. This will help me pay off my bills, and this will give me some direction in my life. And so I did it. And my friends were floored because I was a partier, and I all I did was go out and drink and spend all my money. And no one could understand or believe that I did this. And that's kind of the start and how I got into the military.
Good to know that, all the partiers alike found their way into the military. I mean, at some point in time that skill comes in handy in the military at some certain junctures throughout your career. Doesn't always lead to good things, but it's a skill you should keep in your back pocket. I joke, but it's a good
social skill. No,
there it is. That's a better way to phrase it.
Yeah.
I'm much more direct in my phrasing, as it's gotten me in trouble over the years. But do you start this whole journey not knowing where it's going to go? As you depart, or is there any hesitation? Is there any point in the beginning where you thought you made a bad decision, made the wrong decision, wanted to take it back? How did that go?
Oh, yeah. Well, when I first started going into the process, I mistakenly thought I was going into the reserves. And it wasn't until I got into the MEP station that it was kind of explained to me that this was like a full-time thing that I was going to do all the time. But I didn't really think to say no. I mean, there was also a guy that I was, friends with and kind of seeing at the time, and he sort of talked me into it as well. And I just thought, man, I'll make some good money. I'll get out of my hometown. I'll learn a skill. Maybe they can teach me how to do something that makes more money than waiting tables. I was just kind of open to it. And it was a leap of faith. Because like I said, there was nothing I could compare it to and say, oh, well, this is how it's going to be. And so I was really scared, to be honest. That night before I left for boot camp, I just thought, what the heck have I done? What is this? Because like I said, nobody I grew up with was in the military. I didn't know anybody in the military. And all my friends just thought it was this insane, funny thing that I did. I remember one night we were out drinking and we all got drunk, and they kept singing that stupid "In the Navy" song to me over and over again, just giving me crap about it and going, oh my God, Terry. That's why I went by Terry's going to join the military. What the fuck? No one could believe it. They just didn't believe a person like me would ever end up in the service.
Now, was combat even in your mind? Like, was the idea of being on a naval warship anywhere in your mind? Was any of that, like, did it even cross your mind when you had started? Because we're in a pre 9/11 world.
Mm-hmm. Right. And we were in peacetime, at the time. So I never thought in a million years that any of this would end up I would end up in combat zones. I would end up part of like major operations that were very geopolitically significant. No, I wasn't even really concerned about that because I had steered away from the Marines and the Navy. I mean, the Marines and the Army. And so I thought in my mind, like, I'm in the Navy. Well, what can happen? Like nothing, and I kind of also had this sort of attitude, like I'll figure it out, and I still sometimes have that same attitude. So I think in my mind, I just went for it. I took a leap of faith that it was going to work out.
So where does it actually start for you after, your initial training, your first duty assignment, everything?
Yeah. So after Great Lakes, Illinois, where we do our initial training, I initially went to Pensacola, Florida, and that's where I started my aircrew school. And that was an amazing experience. I had never done any of those type of that type of training where you're basically learning how to do all the different swim strokes the proper way, because it's all training you that if your aircraft goes down, are you going to be able to survive? So I had to go through it was a series of schools. After Pensacola, I got moved to Millington because all the A schools moved. Actually, I went to aircrew school. Then I went to my A school, which is aviation electrician's mate school. And then I even had to go to SEER school. That was in my pipeline, which is survival, evasion, resistance and escape.
That's the one school I wish the military had sent me to. When I heard about that, I'm like, I want to do that. That's the one I want to do. I know people went through there and I'm like, okay, I want to see if I can survive that. That to me seemed cool. Like that seems like a course where, even though it's it's obviously geared military, but like those are skills you can use in life. Like those are mental traits that are going to help you survive life.
I mean, it really just brings you together with your team. I mean, because you're with, of course, a few other people that are all doing the same thing that you're doing. And you even have like this little stratified rank structure. And I had a good experience for what it was. I was just grateful that I got through it. I mean, because you get captured and then there's this whole experience. I mean, of what happens once you're in captivity and all those things. But no, absolutely. I mean, all the schooling I went through a year and a half of schooling before I got to my first duty station in Iceland. And so I really appreciated the different experiences that I was getting when I was going through this pipeline, because I mean, it was a lot. I got trained how to fix aircraft. I got trained how to survive as an air crewman, how to do all the different things that you would have to do if your helicopter or your aircraft went down. And then I got to get trained in how to the P3s. Like I got over an indoctrination in P3s down in Jacksonville. And then I got sent to Keflavik, Iceland to work on the base P3 there before, when they had a NAS Keflavik. It was Naval Air Station Keflavik. And that was my first duty station.
Wow. Okay. So that's a lot. After SEER school, I'm still blown away by that. Where do you end up? Like, where do you end up as far as your first actual duty assignment? What are you doing there?
So I was a in-flight technician. So I would ride in the aircraft as mostly as a glorified flight attendant, to be honest, because it was a VIP MWR aircraft. And so and to be honest, I was only there for about a year and a half. I think it was supposed to be I don't remember if it was a 4 or 5 year tour, but I had some mental health issues and I ended up leaving that duty station earlier than was planned. Right. So I was there for a year and a half. I fixed aircraft, got a bunch of qualifications. That's a big thing in the maintainer world, is once you're aircraft maintainer, you're constantly working on, they call getting your quals. And so you have to learn how to use every single piece of equipment that's going to allow your aircraft to fly and allow your boxes to turn on and to do what they need to do. Because most of the time, they're not going to turn on what they call the auxiliary power unit, or they're not going to rev up the engines just to fix your systems. So you have to learn how to operate the testing equipment that you need in order to run the systems that you need to make sure that when you're troubleshooting, you're identifying what needs to be fixed. And so, yeah, so I was there for a year and a half. And like I said, I had the nervous breakdown. And I got shipped back to Great Lakes, Illinois, and I was supposed to get processed out of the Navy. And instead I fought my med board and stayed into the Navy.
What go more into this whole mental breakdown here and kind of what, led to it. I mean, was it anything military related or it was personal life stuff?
It was totally personal life.
Okay.
So just to paint the picture, I went to that duty station, still pretty naive and emotionally immature. And I got into a few relationships with people at my workplace that did not go very well. And I very much regret what was happening in those relationships, to be honest with you. And it was one of those situations where my chain of command got involved because the person that I was involved with had some legal problems so I was very embarrassed. I was ashamed of what was going on. And I just couldn't handle the stress of it because that was my only support system that I had. I didn't have any friends. I was so attached to this one particular individual and the interactions that we were having. And in my own mind, it was like almost like a death because I just didn't have a very good support. I had not built a good support system around me. And in my mind, it was, like I said, it was almost like you're just dying because you just don't have those people in your life that you can depend on. And so I became psychotic, to be honest. I mean, I'm just going to be very blunt about that. Sure. And I don't know if it was a combination of lack of sleep, being amped up on coffee. I still to this day can't completely explain what happened because it went on and off for about a month. And they didn't really know what to do with me because of the stuff I was saying and the ways in which I was acting. And so they made after they tried sending me home, that didn't work. I was still sort of crazy at home and went to a psych ward at home. And then when I came back, I was still acting weird and saying very strange things that they couldn't understand or decipher. And I remember thinking all I really wanted was them to just talk to me and to understand me, but that was not going to happen. They just needed to know what to do with me. And in that situation, they're not equipped. And mental health was not the thing back then that it is now. Right. And so the best thing to do with someone in that circumstance, in their opinion, was to process me out. And so that's what they tried to do.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question was like, I mean, the military sort of, they try to keep things in a very black and white area, right? They don't like to operate in gray. It's not their specialty because there's a manual somewhere that says this. And if it's in there, then we have to do it. And we don't have any recourse otherwise.
Absolutely.
But to that end, I mean, I know you mentioned before you fought the med board.
I did.
Was there anybody like in your chain of command who was like, either advocating for you to get out or saying, hey, don't worry, Teresa, we're going to do everything we can possible to keep you here? Or, I mean, what was that whole process like?
So when I got to Great Lakes, I ended up getting out of the psych ward almost immediately because I got off the meds and then I stopped. Well, they threatened to kick me out. And I was so afraid of having to go back home. So my motivation was I've got to get better and stop saying these weird things and thinking these weird things. And so I just basically faked it till I made it and said, okay, my mission in life is going to be to stay in the military because I need this money and I need to pay off my debts. And I knew at that point I hadn't paid off all my debts and I didn't want to go back home. I wasn't close with my mom and dad. And so I didn't feel like I had any other option. And so I just became very single-handedly focused on I'm going to stay in the Navy and do whatever it takes to stay in. And throughout that process, I mean, I found God. I worked out all the time. I actually built a really good support system. And it was probably the first time I had ever had like friends outside the party realm, ever since when I was a real little kid, I had that, but not in high school or post high school. And I started building really steady friends. In fact, one I still keep in touch with to this day. And I think that was part of the advocacy was just those people around me. And I did join a support group. There was a social worker there who led a great support group at the hospital. And I was the only one that was staying in. Everybody else, it was a discharge planning group. And it was for people that were all getting kicked out. And I was like the one person in the group that was like, well, no, I'm fighting my board. I'm appealing it. And so I would just I wrote a letter to appeal the board, the first med board. And then I got a psychologist that I was seeing as an outpatient to say, yes, she's good to go. And the physical evaluation board people said, wait a minute, one doctor, the one who admitted you in the hospital, said that you were crazy. This other guy thinks that you're fine. Great Lakes, get your act together and make one decision. So that's why this whole thing dragged out for almost a year. And so after that, I didn't fight the second time. The second board that they wrote me and they found me down because they can't have two people who disagree. I didn't fight it. And then they still found me fit because I had appealed the first board, and I wrote 2 congressmen. I never heard back other than, oh, we're looking into your case, nothing else. But so to this day, I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but that was my first foray into advocacy. So that was the first time I'd ever felt.
Right. I mean, it makes total sense. From the standpoint of this catapulting you into advocacy, I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it really, when you think about it, like, I don't think I'd be the quote unquote change agent that I am today if I hadn't had to fight for my career at such a young age. But it really, and it taught me so much too. It taught me a lot about mental health. It taught me a lot about the system. It was definitely a resilience building process.
All right. So you get through the med board and everything else.
Yeah.
Where do you settle next?
So I lost my ability. I lost my flight status. So I could no longer go into an aircrew billet. They said because of the condition, and because I had a diagnosis of psychotic disorder not otherwise specified. So that was on my record. And that did followed me around all my enlisted career.
Wow.
Yeah. And I had to fight it. Like, I had to get evaluations anytime I wanted to do, like, oh, you want to get backseat qualified on your aircraft. Oh, now you got to go see the psych lady. So I hated psych. And I hated mental health, and I wouldn't, and that's a whole other conversation, but I had this stigma in my mind too about mental health, like, because I saw that, like, oh shit, if I say I have any problems, then they're going to kick me out. So I'm never going to tell anybody that I ever have any problems ever again. And, which is not the right answer. And so, but I did okay. I did really, well, I think. I went to a aviation squadron, S3s, and I worked on the anti-submarine warfare aircraft, the S-3B Viking. And I stayed at that squadron for 4 or 5 years. And that's where I got picked up to be an officer. So immediately following this experience, I go to, VS-35, Blue Wolves, and I work my way up to E5. I'm a final checker troubleshooter. So I launch and recover aircraft on the flight deck. And that's where we are involved in combat operations. Like I say, the Iraq war in Iraq, the shock and awe campaign started, I want to say 2002, September 2002 is where we got turned around, or around that time, where we were supposed to go, home, and then we all came back, and we were involved in that campaign. And that is right around the time I got picked up for Seaman to Admiral, which is my commissioning program.
I mean, I'm curious how, with the stigma that you had would have been stapled to your career about your mental health, that you were able to get into the officer world. I feel like that is something that would have been a disqualifier.
It was incredibly hard. So what I did is, even before I put the package in, I went and saw a psychologist, and they said that I was fit to put in an officer package. And at that point, I hadn't had any issues, like I said, since that incident. I wasn't on any medication, nothing. And so they said I was okay, because I guess they just couldn't say that there was something wrong with me, because there wasn't at that time. And I don't think the rules were as set in stone about these officer programs. Like, I wonder if today, with the same diagnosis, if I would have been able to get in. But they said I was fit to put in the package. And then once I got picked up, then they wanted to see all my medical records again. And I was like, oh man, they're going to dig, they're going to know. And I was very honest with my commanding officer, to his credit, just very grateful for him to this day. He went to bat for me. So I was on the aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, and he went and saw the ship's psychologist and had to sit down with her. I sat down with her, got this big report, and they all supported me and said, she should become a naval officer. And so we went back to Great Lakes, and I mean, not Great Lakes, but we went back to BUMED, Bureau of Medicine, and they agreed to write me a waiver. And that was sort of the end of this. So other than my secret clearance when upon commission, that was the one last time I had to deal with it. Now it's long gone. It's ancient history. But yeah, it was definitely something that was painful that I had to continue to talk about and revisit over and over again and prove that I was okay, which made it really hard for me to ever seek mental health services until now. In fact, I'm in therapy now, and it's the first time I've really sought routine therapy other than Military OneSource since this incident. And it's because I had such a stigma because of what had happened. But again, I did it to myself. I mean, I can't blame anyone. Again, I'm all about accountability. And I do believe that this experience really made me who I am today.
Well, again, I mean, to phrase it as I have nobody to blame but myself is, from the outside looking in, is a little harsh. I would tell you that, yes, taking accountability for it is important, but there is a certain amount of, we need to evaluate the individual and where they are, not just what we read on a piece of paper about them. And that's what's sort of bad sometimes about the military. Again, when we have these waiver systems and everything else, they never really actually sit down and talk to a person. What they do is they look at a packet and a file and a letter of recommendation, everything else, and they decide from there, without ever meeting the individual, whether this is somebody that we find worthy or not. You know, I mean, those sort of review boards and boards that go, it's not like the old NCO. I'm an Army guy. It's not like the old NCO boards where you used to have to stand in front of everybody and there would be a whole room looking at you and asking you questions and asking you to prove your competency in those boards. We don't do that as much anymore. But when it comes to like medical stuff, is particularly and accessions, it's all paperwork in a room with people who have never met you, have never seen you, and have no idea who you are. And so one or two subjective evaluations on anything, whether it's performance, potential, you know, medical could obviously send your career in one direction or another. So I think there's, you know, I don't want perfect to be the enemy of good, in a sense where there might be a better system. I don't need it to be perfect, but there might be better than what we have in these situations.
Well, so, and the problem is that the people who are evaluating you for your officer program, you stand in front of them and all you talk about is your performance. Right. You don't talk about the whole sailor, right? Like they don't ask those kinds of questions because no one wants to talk about their personal life or their personal issues. And so the only time that they're even going to know any of that is if you volunteer that information. And so there's just no real opportunity for people to see what it is, who you are as a whole person for these evaluation boards. It definitely is something that could be better. I agree.
So when you get through this whole process and you get your commission, you start now, do you know what you want to do as an officer at this point in time, or are you kind of leaving it up to whatever they think?
So when I put in my Stay 21 package, I had always grown up thinking I was maybe wanting to be a social worker. I'm adopted. And so I've always had sort of a soft spot for people that have had trauma in their background. And so I thought that would be a really good thing, although there's no social workers in the Navy. So I thought, well, maybe nurse is something that I could do that maybe I'd be good at. Again, I had written a journal in high school grade school, and was very praised for it. And I even met with a journalist when I was in 8th grade on this like career day, but I hadn't really connected the pieces about me perhaps being a communicator. Like that just didn't even really register in my brain at that point that was something I would want to do. And so I sort of leaned towards some sort of social services or a helping profession. And I didn't get selected for that. And so I got selected for what they call the URL program, unrestricted line. So I'm like, okay, it's called, I think it was called the core option. And so when I got selected for that, it was, I could go, there was no subservice option for women at the time. So I think it was pilot, NFO, or pilot, NFO, or SWO, surface warfare officer. And surface warfare officer was the most generic one that anyone could get into, kind of thing, which later on I find out like how hard it is really to be a SWO. But I just thought, well, that's just a good entry into the real Navy, you know, like, because I come from the aviation community where we aviators, we kind of looked at like that, we call them the brown shoe ratings versus the black shoe ratings. We saw the ship's company differently. And I thought, well, I've already done the aviation field. I know that field. I don't want to be a pilot. I don't want to be an NFO. Why don't I just go SWO? That might be kind of cool. I'll get into the black shoe, the heart of the Navy, right? Where we drive warships and we work in combat and we work in engineering. And so that was what I chose to do.
All right. So, by the way, where is 9/11 happening in all of this?
So 9/11.
Had it happened yet by the time you were an officer?
Yes. No? Oh, yes. Because I was enlisted when we went into Iraq. So
okay.
So I remember even when the Cole got attacked, I was on deployment. So I did a series of deployments on USS Abraham Lincoln when I was with VS-35. So I had already seen the difference in tempo and in operations between steady state peacetime and let's go to war. And now things that you would never call up on an aircraft, you're just going to go, oh, it's good to go. You might not need that backup to the backup to the backup. So I had already gotten a kind of a taste for what life was like in a combat environment, not of course being shot or being shot at, but in a much more pressurized and stressful environment. So as I got into my officer schools, that the 9/11 and the war in Iraq and Afghanistan was already going on. And I was going through school at that time. So I was going through Worcester State College. I had gone to my officer schools. They call them the knife and fork schools in Rhode Island. That's where you just learn how to be an officer. You go to Naval Science Institute courses and things like that. And I had met my ex-husband out in Rhode Island. And the decision was made for me to stay there with his family and stay local. And so I decided to go to college in Worcester, Massachusetts. And that's where I got my undergrad. I was part of the Holy Cross Consortium. That's a Holy Cross and I was part of an inter-OTC unit. So I had to be, I wouldn't call it a midshipman. I think they called us officer candidates. So I had to do all that as a fleet returnee. And it was a interesting experience. I had to take a regatta course, do a bunch of what we call maneuvering board training and all these things. But like I said, I was in my late 20s and most everybody else was in their late teens, early 20s.
All right. So all this is, and I guess I kind of, glossed over it mistakenly, but, we talked about the idea of you going to war and everything else before. And I guess the personal stuff had sort of superseded any idea that would come into your view, right? I mean, you weren't, it was the furthest thing from your mind while you were going through all the med board stuff and everything else.
Well, the med board stuff had already ended by the time the Iraq and Afghanistan stuff had started. Okay. So at this point, I'm just AE2 or AE3 Pickard. That was my maiden name. And I was, wearing my tool pouch and going out there to fix aircraft problems. I was a maintainer. So if you know anything about aircraft maintainers, I mean, it's a rough lifestyle. I mean, you're working constantly. You're dirty every day. You're constantly trying to figure out how to insert very small parts in crazy crevices all over the aircraft. You're very frustrated sometimes because you'll try 6 things and then the 7th thing might actually fix the airplane. But you're using schematics every day, using your multimeter, going out there. I mean, I was a gearhead, which is crazy now when I look back on it because my husband's like, how in the hell did you ever know how to fix anything? And,
not the homemaker you thought you were going to be, I guess.
No.
All right. So kind of fast forwarding a little bit, when do you get to your first deployment then?
So your first deployment as an officer or first deployment enlisted?
As an officer.
Okay. Yeah. So first deployment as an officer was as a surface warfare officer. I did a surge deployment with USS Russell. So that is a DDG, DDG 59. And he's now an admiral. Admiral Brad Cooper was my commanding officer. Actually, it started off as admiral, and he's also an admiral, I think, John Kirby or Jim Kirby. And then
John Kirby's running.
No, John Kirby's the Pentagon spokesperson. No, yeah. there's another Kirby.
John Kirby? Okay.
Yeah, I think he's the Fleet Forces deputy right now. But he was my first commanding officer, and I only was with him for a couple months. And then now Admiral Cooper took over, and we went on a surge deployment. I actually met them while they were still deployed. So they were coming off the tail end of their deployment. Then we went on the surge deployment. So I did just some I would call them mini deployments, where we went to mostly Asia Pacific area. So I did those with USS Russell. And that's where I got my surface warfare officer pin. That was a very good experience. I was in an amazing, what we call an award room with great officers. And I wasn't a part of that many operationally relevant events, if I can remember correctly, although I'd probably have to go back. I was only there for about a year and a half. I do believe we did some stuff that was involved with North Korea during that time. But then I went to, after that, this is where I have to kind of remember, this is where I got into the PAO community. So
right. Well, that was what I was going to ask you about next.
Yep. Yeah.
So I mean, is that something you wanted to do, or is it Navy directed?
Oh, no. So when I was going through my officer program, I spent one summer at a muscular dystrophy camp, and I met some people that were Navy journalists, and they told me that there was this thing called PAO. I had no idea. Didn't even know there were MCs. That's that. I just, as an Airedale I think I may have seen them on the carrier. I just wasn't really aware of what they did or had a lot of visibility or interaction with PAOs. In fact, I even had a New York Times reporter who interviewed me during the war, and while I was in the library working on my enlisted surface warfare qualification. And I didn't even know that there was this PAO team and all these things. So I found out about it. And as soon as I found out about it, I was like, whoa, that's something I could do and maybe be really good at. And I just remember like a light bulb went off, because it was almost like, wait a second, I've been doing this job that I don't really love for all these years, but it's the Navy, and I do like being in the Navy. What if I found something in the Navy that I actually loved doing? What would that be like? And so that was how I got started. And I made my master's, my undergrad, communications undergrad. I interned at a newspaper. And then as soon as I got to my first ship, Russell, that DDG, I asked them to make me the collateral duty PAO. And so that's where I started building my resume. And I learned how to take photos on a ship. I learned how to write articles. I was taught by an MCC, Chief Rush at Navy Region, Hawaii. He and I would go back and forth, and we'd edit stories together. And so I just learned on the job how to do all these things. We didn't have a mass communication specialist embarked on the ship or any of that back then. I just picked up a camera and started trying to take pictures and learn and make a lot of mistakes and just keep doing it over and over again.
Wow. Pretty amazing. So you embark on this, before we get to the PAO stuff, you actually did the deployment with the SEALs and Army SF, right?
So the Army SEALs and SF deployment was an individual augmentee assignment. So during the whole, Iraq and Afghanistan era, they were pulling people from other services to assist the Army and the Marine Corps. And primarily they were starting to send people on individual augmentee assignments. So there were a lot of billets and opportunities to send people to combat zones. And I ended up going to the Philippines. So in the southern Philippines, in Zamboanga, in the base, it's a Armed Forces of the Philippines base called in Mindanao. They had a military presence, a U.S. military presence, and it was comprised of trainers who would train, advise, and assist Armed Forces of the Philippines with their Abu Sayyaf terrorism issue. So there was a very, and there were some people who felt that there was ties to Al Qaeda. So that was sort of the tie to GWOT, the Global War on Terrorism. And so I went down there for 6 months as their public affairs officer for JSOTF, Joint Special Operations Task Force Philippines.
I had Joint Special Operations Task Force AP, Arabian Peninsula.
Okay.
So you were P, I was AP back in the day.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's all CJSOTF, of Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force. It's a nice big acronym.
Yes.
Is this and this is your first real foray into like the PAO combat realm, correct?
Oh yeah. I mean, I'd gone to Russell and played PAO for, about a year as I was getting my service warfare officer pin and getting into the community. But when I went over to Pacific Fleet, I was still in Hawaii at the time. They made me the community relations director, and I was doing that for a while, and I was helping, get the aircraft carriers DVs. So they would send people that were educators and other kind of influencers out to the carrier when it would pull around in the Hawaii operation area. But during that time, this opportunity came up and they needed someone to go serve a 6-month individual augmentee assignment in the Philippines. And I really didn't understand what it was, why we were there, what the mission or the role of the U.S. forces were there. But that's what really taught me everything about like embassies. Like I didn't understand any of that, or HADR. So while I was there was a huge flood. In fact, the day I got there, I'm literally relieving Laura Bollinger, and we are working side by side in, I want to say, in Manila? Yeah, we went up to Manila and we were working side by side on flood relief efforts and going out to I remember I went out with my camera and I took a picture of the SEALs rescuing people off of a bridge with their, like the rib boat. And I remember just thinking, like, how bizarre is this? I'm standing in floodwater with my camera, and I've been on the ground for 2 weeks, and I'm already taking these pictures and covering this historical event. I mean, it was really surreal. And one of the pictures I ended up in Life magazine. And I mean, it wasn't an amazing photo, but it was one of those things where I was really just close to what was happening. And I was always the kind of person that would just run into what, I mean, I'm not afraid to get dirty or to get into the mix of things. And so, yeah. And
were you accepted by, how did the special operations guys look at the PAO world at that point in time?
It's dependent on the PAO, I mean, I was, because I didn't complain, and I didn't, I just wanted to be there, and I wanted to cover them, and I wanted to take pictures, and I wanted to tell their story. And they knew that I was genuine. And so I never had a bad experience there. I really respected the SF guys and the Navy SEALs. And I always felt like they gave me tons of access. And I felt their very blunt and direct demeanor was something that I could identify with, because I am so blunt and so direct. And so for me, it was a great experience, to be honest with you. I mean, it was hard, and I got frustrated being stuck in Zamboanga sometimes, because I wanted to get down. Like we had like Task Force Sulu, we had Basilan, we had all these different outposts. And so my thing was, one of our PAOs had to always be in Manila and doing the embassy stuff. And then someone like me, who's lower ranking, could be down south. And so I was just always trying to angle to get on trips and to go places and to be where we were either, conducting a class, or we were doing some sort of training or doing a rescue mission. Like sometimes we would do HADR, and then sometimes we would actually do operations. And of course I couldn't cover any of that. So that was probably the hardest part too, was that there were still some things that I wasn't privy to because of being the PAO. And there were a lot of restrictions with the embassy, because there were sensitivities about special forces being in the Philippines. There was a lot of push and pull between us and the embassy. And that's where I learned all the nuances of the military and the State Department and the differences between the two.
Yeah, that's a whole different podcast in and of itself.
Yes.
Let me ask you, because, again, now the Navy at this point, when you're in the Philippines in 2008, 2009, the Navy has a full-on role in Iraq and Afghanistan that go well beyond just being on a ship in a port waiting for, something to happen. Or is there part of you that is sort of itching to get to those locations?
No, because I had a defined path of what I wanted to do as a PAO and what I wanted to see. I knew I wanted to be a carrier PAO. That's the pinnacle job. in a public affairs officer's career in the Navy is to go serve on an aircraft carrier. And I had that in my mind that was what I was going to do from day one of being in the community. So for me, I knew that that's where the operations would lie. Little did I understand back then that I'd have a better tour on my amphib, on an amphibious assault ship, than I did on my carrier, just because I really dug working with Marines and Navy at the same time. And and then that was just a better tour for me. It was on the USS Boxer. But at the time, that was just what my goal was. There was never a part of me that was like, oh gosh, I really want to go to Iraq and Afghanistan and be a part of the fight. I would have, like, if I'd been called to go do that, I would have done it. But I think in my mind, I was just focused on where the Navy needed me and where I thought the operations would lie for me as a communicator. I really wanted to be in the most challenging positions that our community would provide. And I didn't want to be stuck at the Pentagon. And I'm still haven't done a Pentagon.
No, sure. I understand. I guess, and again, maybe it's my infamiliarity with the Navy. I mean, I would equate a carrier to the idea of a division in the Army. Mm-hmm. There's 10 of them, right? Like 10 major divisions. Right. So there's only a handful of carriers out there that I'm aware of. But I say all that to say that, understanding that experience, of getting to that job was there were a lot of other jobs before then I needed to do, include go to combat on my own. So I find it interesting that most of the folks in the public affairs world I knew and that we've interviewed on the show have always sort of thrived in that, let me get into Iraq and Afghanistan kind of deal, because that's where all of the action is. But you are seeing just a completely different side of that.
Well, and you got to remember that as like Amy Forsythe, for an example, she's a prior Marine. And so she
guest on the show.
yes. And so she did go to Iraq and Afghanistan, but as a Navy person, I would bet you would be hard pressed to find that many Navy PAOs other than Amy who have deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Sure. There's probably a tiny few. But for us, the pinnacle of our operational job is at sea. I mean, gotcha. we're gonna do our war fighting on the water. Whereas, so I'm not going to go and be land based in Iraq and Afghanistan. So that's just not part of my.
Right. Okay.
That's not part of my pipeline.
Yep. Makes sense. You end up on the USS Nimitz, correct?
I did. That was where I did my carrier public affairs tour. Yes.
All right. And what was that like?
It was very, very challenging. So I got to that tour in 2016, fresh off of a horrible breakup. So now we're going to go back to the personal life. My dog had died. I was alone and I decided to buy an RV because someone said, oh, you should buy an RV because you're never going to be home. And I was like, okay, I'll do that. I'll buy this piece of shit RV because I'll lowball it and not know what I'm doing. Another probably crazy decision. And looking back on it, I'd never be with my husband if I hadn't made this bad decision. But so I buy a piece of shit RV that breaks down even on the way there and have to like get it towed and all these things. And I just came there and I was pretty depleted, to be honest with you, in 2016 when I got to that carrier tour. Here it was, I'm supposed to be on my milestone 04 tour. And my boyfriend of a year had just broken. I was divorced from my first husband and I had been with this guy almost a year. He unexpectedly broke up with me. So I had no one. And here I am almost 40 and single, living in a piece of shit, broke down RV. My dog had died that summer on the way there. Like driving out there. Oh, I had to put my dog down.
Country song in the making right here.
It was horrible. It was pathetic. Like I had a neighbor, bless her heart. I mean, Linda, who rode with me. She drove my car while I drove the RV. I mean, we were quite the pair going from San Diego. Yes, up to Washington. Oh, and I love her to death. I mean, we had so many good talks and we really got to know each other. She's a retired police officer. And but we didn't really know each other that well. She just offered to drive with me, probably because she felt sorry for me. Because she's like, how are you going to get your car and your RV all the way from San Diego up to Washington? I'm like, I don't know. Maybe I'll have it delivered. I think I had said like maybe I'd get a car service to like get my car there and I would drive the RV. And then she's like, no, I'll drive your car. You drive the RV. And I'm like, okay. So I drive the RV breaks down. She ends up taking a train back and I drive the car into Washington State. And there begins my tour on USS Nimitz as the department head. I was a department head in charge of 25 mass communication specialists and a couple senior enlisted. And on a very large staff, 3,200 is usually the number of people. Then when the aviators come on board, the air wing, you're talking 5,000, over 5,000 on deployment, and then plus the whole carrier strike group. So, that was the beginning of that tour. It was definitely a rocky start, and it stayed rocky throughout. This was probably one of my hardest tours.
What was the Nimitz doing that whole time? Were they out at sea?
No, they were in the shipyard when I first got there. So they were in the shipyard. And during that time, it was a lot of downtime because of that. And I learned a lot about hard hats and what life is like. And I'd been in a shipyard before on a few other ships, but this was a more intense shipyard period. It was delayed a few times, which worked to my advantage because I was told I was going to deploy pretty quickly on workups. They call them workups. So before you go underway, you do all this, cycle of training, right? You do all these different, we call sea trials, and you do all these different exercises to get ready to go on deployment. Well, all that stuff got pushed to the right. And during that time, I started dating my now husband. So I had this time to like get to know Harry and start the courting process while at the same time I'm trying to figure out how to lead. And to tell you the truth, Mark, I had led four broadcasters, 4 journalists, 4 photographers maybe. I had never been in charge of 25. Like I really didn't understand how to be a leader. And here I have 25 people and I'm with all these like 05 department heads, seasoned guys. Oh, and I was the only female too. And I just felt a complete imposter. I did. And like I said, I was kind of pathetic and and just sad. And it was really, really hard. That first few months. Luckily, my husband was there for the first part, but then when we started going underway in the deployment, that's when shit hit the fan and things got real.
Well, let's get to that then, because I like the real stuff.
Okay.
So first.
Yeah. So we ended up going underway, and as we started to go underway, it became abundantly clear that I had a lot of growing up to do as a leader. I was passive aggressive in terms of like, I was not good with, what do you call it? Crucial conversations. I wasn't really good at being able to express, when I had issues, and I didn't involve my XO early and often. I didn't trust him. Looking back, I should have. It really didn't matter if I didn't trust him or if I did. What I should have done is told him the problems that I was having and the ways in which my leadership was being questioned. And then I should have asked him if the ways that I was dealing with it were appropriate, because then it wouldn't have just been me. But instead, I didn't think I had anybody to go to. Again, it's, I think I kind of fall back on not being open and not telling people about things that are going on until they just get to a point where they blow up on me. And that's kind of what happened, is that it got to a place where, into the deployment now after, several months of workups, and my XO starts getting word that there's some people in my department that are not happy with the way that I'm leading. And I knew these problems existed, and I thought that I was kind of keeping them at bay and I was handling them, but apparently I certainly wasn't. And so he took matters into his own hands. He wrote me up. He wrote me up on a lot of things that I was able to explain to him once we were able to sit down, and he understood. But at the same time, again, I didn't let my chain know what was going on. I kept them in the dark because I was afraid to fail. And I was afraid that if they understood how the problems I was having, they wouldn't want to deal with it. They just wanted me to take care of it. And so he threatened to fire me, but he didn't. He said I had a lot of tribal knowledge, and he didn't want, he didn't want to let me go, and he wanted me to give me a chance to lead. And really, I'll tell you the truth, Mark, what I learned from that experience was that you can't hold these super high, unrealistic standards. You really have to understand where people are at and meet them at that level. And I started to back off a little bit, and I started to realize that maybe some of the things that I was expecting out of my team was a little bit too ambitious. And I was pushing them a little harder than what they were ready to do. And then I was pushing them harder than what even my leadership needed them to do. And once I understood that and I backed off, things got a lot better. So I was able to fix a lot of the issues towards the end. But it was definitely hard. I was involved in a power struggle between me and my division officer, and the whole team saw that. And unfortunately, I let that bleed over into some situations that truly I do regret. But I'm so darn glad it happened, to be honest with you, because it has changed the way I lead today because of it. Like, I'm a different person. I lead differently now. I communicate differently. And if I hadn't been tested like that, I don't think I'd be the person I am now.
I wonder, in this whole sort of trial and tribulation thing, you have this job that you want so badly. Did you ever think that maybe you just weren't cut out for it? I mean, how much did you question yourself in this whole thing?
Yes, there were definitely times when I was out there that I thought, I just don't have what it takes. Other people can do this job, but I'm not good enough. I think that because of the trauma that I experienced as a child, I tended to always blame myself. And I still to this day do that. I am so much more critical of myself than I am of anybody else. And I think that I constantly had to say, am I cut out for this job? But at the same time, I also felt like I love to tell stories, and I love good product, and I love the feeling that you can get when you bring someone's story to life. It's such a satisfying feeling. And so I knew that I was cut out to be a storyteller. Did I question whether or not I was cut out to be a leader? Absolutely. Because I'd never led before. I wasn't a natural born leader. It wasn't like I had been trained in high school and college and everything that led up to my life to say, this is where I should be. And so I definitely didn't feel like I was on the same level with my peers at all. But at the same time, I worked very, very hard. I delivered every product that we were expected to deliver. And I learned how to properly lead. I learned how to communicate when I was having problems and how to share more. It really brought me and my XO closer together, to be honest with you, because I had part of my remediation was I had to give them updates on how things were going. Like every week I had to let them know what was going on. And so I started just being really open about some of the struggles I was having. And we would have these heart to hearts and we would talk about the things that I was struggling with. And I think that ultimately it helped me. And I mean, I've kept in touch with this particular XO to this day. And, I'm really glad that he didn't kick me off the ship, and he gave me that opportunity to fix it and to right the ship, so to speak. And we ended up, we won like 18, 19 communication awards.
Wow.
We were a rock star team. I mean, that we were known like across the waterfront as being like one of the top carrier public affairs teams. And, I credit a lot of that to the fact that we did really have great people on my team, and we always made the mission. It was very hard. Public affairs, they want everything out of you. You can talk to any PAO about this. It's like no one really understands what we do. And everybody thinks that they can be a communicator. Everyone thinks they got the answer for how we should say something, where we should say something, how much of what we should say something. So you're constantly having to adjust expectations and having to meet deliverables for multiple bosses. And so that's what makes our job stressful. It's not so much the combat, like getting shot at. It's more just understanding how to prioritize everything that's being thrown at you and go, okay, I can do this, but I can't do this. And then who do you disappoint and how? I mean, leadership 101.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I wonder, I know you had conversations, you had mentioned you had conversations with the XO and other peers. Did you have conversations with those that you were leading, with your subordinates, about everything that had went on?
Oh, definitely. I had many conversations with my senior enlisted. I had conversations with my guys. I was pretty open about what was going on. And I'll tell you, towards the end, I just made sure that the guys didn't see the issues that I was having with my number two. I think that was the problem, is that it was very obvious, the tension between her and me. And I knew that as the leader and as the more senior person, it was up to me to change that and to fix that dynamic. And so I did everything that I could to support her. I support her to this day. We're still in touch. And I feel that by being as open as I was about it, it definitely, I hope anyway, it was helpful for them. It was definitely where I was really, like you say, I had to fall. I mean, I had to fall, and I had to be not the best leader all the time, but at the same time, I would rather have had that opportunity and been able to grow from it than, like I say, some people, they just get, they just kick them off the ship and say, nope, you can't hack it. See ya. We'll find somebody who can. And I think that's unfortunate, because it doesn't give people that opportunity to grow and to lead. I mean, I don't have anywhere. In fact, I don't have any of these issues now, in charge of 7 people in a very much more stressful environment and at a much higher level now. And I credit that to all the lessons learned from that job. I mean, there's just things I don't do now, because I had that experience.
Well, how much did you take it to the next deployment that you went on the Boxer, which was that amphibious squadron thing?
Boxer was before Nimitz.
Okay.
And when I was on Boxer, I didn't have any of these issues either. Again, I had a very small team, and I wasn't and my scope of responsibilities was much more limited. I kind of, going from an amphib to going from a carrier, especially because of the DV program, that's the hardest thing you do as a carrier PAO, is managing the DVs. And every fleet will send you tons of people that descend upon your ship, and you have to basically convince an entire ship that this is something that they want to do when nobody wants to really do it, because it takes away from operations. And it's not that they don't want to do it. It's just, it's very tough to manage.
Who were some of your more notable distinguished visitors that came by?
Well, we would get anybody from actors, famous people sometimes. I mean, Woody Harrelson was on one of the ones I was on. Yeah, that was actually when I was out there as an assessor. So after this carrier tour, so I do the amphib tour, amphib PAO, that's, Marines and Navy. I do that one. I do the carrier PAO, and I did some grad school here and there in between this. Then I go on to be an assessor. So I got to be the grader that does, that assesses the amphibs and the carriers, which was really rewarding, because I knew all the pitfalls. I knew all the things to avoid. I knew what good products look like. I knew what bad products look like. I had all the right templates. I knew how to give media training. I knew how to do the things that I felt would make a successful carrier PAO. And I got to be a part of this program that would help train public affairs officers on how to capture uncontrolled motion at sea for Russian and Chinese vessels who decide to sneak up on our ships and get too close. And we call them unsafe, unprofessional interactions. And that was a really rewarding opportunity to learn how to properly capture those moments, to basically get in front of the narrative and show that who the aggressors were and who were the ones who were unsafe and unprofessional at sea. So to answer your first question, to go back to that, I mean, did I share enough with my people what was going on? Maybe not. I mean, looking back, there was probably more that I could have shared. It was a very traumatic experience for me, to be honest. And it took me a long time and to process what had happened and to kind of move through it. But like I said, now I don't have any regrets about it because I know it made me better.
I mean, when you look back on it, what was tougher for you going through your own sort of personal struggles at times through your career, or this professional struggle that you went through?
Oh, that's such a great question. I honestly think that they intertwine, because your personal struggles are what I call your trauma. So I've been diagnosed with complex trauma, and complex trauma means it's a series of events that have happened in your childhood, or may have happened, maybe not in your childhood, but it's not just one thing. Like somebody gets shot at one time, that's a one-time event. But when you've had abuse, whatever kind of abuse that happens over and over and over again, repeatedly, and there's no escape from it, it goes on for years, you develop certain responses. And I'm still, like I said, I'm in therapy now. I've been on it for about 2 months now. I go every week, and we're just now starting to kind of unpack what those impacts are and what those effects are. So I would argue that the biggest challenges that people have, I believe, come from things within them that they haven't processed and worked through, that they carry to the workplace, and that impact their ability to lead, impact their ability to perform the mission and to react to certain situations. So I would say both. There was the professional struggles, but those professional struggles were rooted in the trauma that I hadn't been able to process and work properly through.
Now that you're done being a sort of at least at this point in your career, I don't know if you know that you're done being a PAO at sea, so to speak, or at least on a ship, you're going to move into something else. Before you get to those other missions, were you sort of excited that you were going to do something that wasn't on a ship, or were you sort of bummed out?
Oh no, I got to go to NATO. Like, I was totally stoked. I was like, whoa, I'm going to work with all these international nations. And
yeah, but that sounds great. Like, I don't know if I would, I'd be skeptical on the surface.
No, I mean, think about how relevant we are right now. I mean,
well, yeah, but you couldn't have planned for that.
No, but I knew that's true. I'm trying to think of when I got orders here. So because I was in Germany for 4 months as we went into Ukraine, or as Russia started their unprovoked attack on Ukraine. And right. So I'm trying to remember when I got the orders. Did I know? No, you're right. I didn't. They offered me MARCOM at my last job. And I remember just thinking, like, well, it was again another adventure, Mark. It was one of those things where I was like, whoa, I've never served. I mean, other than my time in the Iceland, I've never served overseas. I had an overseas duty station. I've never worked with all these different nations. But to be honest, there were people who told me that NATO was a joke. I won't lie. There were people who told me, like, oh, it's just a bunch of people networking and hodgepodging and blah, blah, blah. That is not what I experience every day at all. But that's what I was told. And so I was a little prepared for this to be a joke of a job. And I remember my predecessor's like, Teresa, this job is so busy. And Eric is like my predecessor. He's kind of like a cool guy, he's just pleasant and nice. And I was like, that's just Eric. He's just telling me it's busy. It's not really that busy. And then I get here and I'm like, oh my God, there's like constantly something to react to, something to respond to. This is such a dynamic theater with so many things that are going on. I mean, there's like Russian spy ships happen, in our region. There's, Baltic Sea activity. There's all this different things, critical infrastructure protection, all these things that we're doing that are so incredibly important. And all these NATO countries are now so joined up together to, in my view, stop something very bad from happening that could possibly happen potentially. I mean, it already has happened in Ukraine. And so I see this as a very relevant place to be. And I think I'm exactly where I want to be and where I should be. So, and I believe in the mission.
What is the mission?
Okay. No, great question.
I just, it seems so nebulous to know for anybody who hasn't ever worked in, let's just even say it on the small scale, Pentagon OSD, right? Like if you've never worked in there, you don't really understand what they do day to day.
Right.
Oh, they run the military, right? Like it's the same thing. NATO is like a nebulous concept.
It is.
Because I've never worked there. And what does NATO do?
So we have
sit around with Kofi Annan and just
no
all day long. What are we doing? So
we have ships. We have 4 standing naval task forces. So each country, our NATO maritime nations have contributed their assets to perform operations at sea as part of 4 standing naval task forces that I believe rotate out every 6 months. So we are constantly at sea performing different exercises and different operations. So it's the same kind of stuff that you would do in a single country, right? You do interoperability, you do different drills to basically strengthen your skill sets in the different warfare domains. And as a communicator for NATO, it is my job, and a year-long security assistance mission called Operation Sea Guardian in the Mediterranean. So we're out there basically patrolling the waters, keeping them safe, and ensuring that if Russia or some of these other or a nefarious actor does something, we're there to respond. We are still, like I said, we're not at a point right now where we're at war. But I do believe that the training and the readiness and the things that we do day to day will put us in a position so that if something does happen, we're prepared to respond. And I will say that I have never been at a place where I think like, wow, something could really shake out. Like there's certainly a potential at some point in the future, based on what we've seen in Ukraine, that this conflict sadly could spill over to a NATO nation. And if a NATO nation is attacked, I believe it's, don't quote me, but like the Article 5 treaty that says if you attack this NATO nation, then we will respond, we'll be obligated to respond appropriately. So it definitely puts an added pressure and tension in the region, because this is a pressurized situation. I mean, when the war in Ukraine first happened, I mean, it was a big news item, and I know now it's kind of died down, but I mean, there's still people dying over there. I mean, there's still a conflict that's happening, and there's still support that I feel is needed for that conflict. And I don't want to get into all the geopolitical,
Sure,
nuances of that. I mean, I really want to stick to what I do as a communicator, but I will say that having a mission that I believe in, having leadership at MARCOM, at Allied Maritime Command, that I trust and that I support has been a game changer for me. I haven't always felt this way. And I think I've said that in a couple of my social media posts. I've had a lot of jobs sometimes, sadly, where I didn't necessarily go along to get along, or I didn't always agree with what we were doing. But this is not one of those jobs. I support what we're doing. And I think that we've got to be ready, because we really just don't know what will happen. That's the sense that I get there.
Yeah, no, again, I think that's a fair assessment, and I appreciate your desire not to make any sort of statement on the war in Ukraine and what it is and what it isn't, because again, that's a whole nother podcast in and of itself that I would argue I'm not necessarily qualified to discuss. I certainly have an opinion, but again, a whole different podcast. So all that aside, you hold this job now. What is like next for you from a military standpoint in the Navy? I mean, do you want to go back to a ship? Do you want to stay where you are? What's next?
So as an 05, I'll never get assigned to a ship again. I've qualified out of that stage in my career. So I would have to go to a fleet or a TICOM, fleet command, like a 3rd Fleet, 7th Fleet, where, we're in charge of the ships that are actively at sea, or TICOM, where we deal with training and manning and equipping the ships that go to sea. Those are the two competitive 06 maker operational jobs that I would desire if I were continuing to go on. Now, if I decide to retire in September or around September, when I would be submitting my intent to retire, then that takes me out of the game completely. I am waiting to see how I feel, to be honest with you, and what's offered. So I'm really on the fence. It's really hard because I'm a podcaster and I have a show that I'm very passionate about, and I don't need the money anymore, to be honest with you, Mark. I'm financially stable. So this is not about the money anymore. It's really just about the love of the job. If, like, I love Marcom and I like my coworkers and I like my team, and we all get along well and we all are passionate about the mission. And so if I could continue on at Marcom, or I could stay in the NATO family, maybe, I don't know. But I know that I'm going to have to make a decision, and it's not going to be easy. I really don't know which way I'm going to go, to be honest. I think I'm leaning more towards retirement, but at the same time, if the right billet was to make itself available and I was to kind of get a sense of who the leadership would be, I mean, of course, they can change a million times, but having good people around you and having the right boss really makes a big difference. And so I might be convinced to continue on, depending on what the offer is.
Let's talk about the podcast.
All right.
The Stories of Service. Look, you've been doing this for a while now. And I saw on your LinkedIn, you had over 3,500 podcast downloads. So you're well on your way to creating something that has a lot of movement. Why'd you want to start it? How did you come about it? And what do you hope to accomplish with it?
Great question. It's so funny because it's like, I can't believe we spent all this time up until now, not even talking about my podcast, but my operational career. It's thank you so much for, number one, for giving me the opportunity to reflect back on some of that stuff. I don't talk about it ever. And it's interesting to have those conversations.
I would argue, sorry to cut you off, but I would argue that a lot of the things that you're going to talk about in your podcast are foundationally built from your operational background.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. So I started the podcast 2 years ago, and it got started because, truthfully, I got asked to write a chapter in a book. Karen Hills Pruden, she's a career coach. She approached me on LinkedIn. I started off very active on Facebook. I had a blog since 2014. And then I started moving some of my content over to LinkedIn, and it started growing. Through that process, I was approached to write a chapter in a book, and that was such an amazing experience. And so it just kind of built, right? Started with the blog since 14, active on Facebook. And I'd always been into advocacy and animal protection causes. I protested outside of puppy stores, and I've had experiences at the state legislature, at city council. I've done some of that stuff. So it wasn't until I wrote the book chapter, and I was also the public affairs officer for the Sea Services Leadership Association. And when COVID hit, we started doing all these webinars online, and I started hosting some of the webinars. So I started going, wait a minute, like, I could do this on my own. Like, I could have my own guests on and talk to people. I don't have to do this through a nonprofit. I can just ask people that I find interesting to come and talk to me. And it started with Tiger King, actually, because I had a lady on who, when Tiger King came out during COVID, everybody was, oh my God, Carol Baskin and whatever that guy's name was, I forget, their feud. And I was like, it's not about their feud. Joe Exotic. Joe Exotic.
I knew there was
yeah. Well, everybody made it into this, joke and this campy joke, but at the core of it is animal abuse, and it's the captivity of tigers and these pay for play, schemes where these poor tigers are ripped away from their mamas and forced to be these little petting machines. And and Carol Baskin has been this. I mean, she's a little quirky in herself, but she's a damn good spokesperson and advocate for this cause. And I just watched her and then watched how they pitted the two of them against each other. And it disgusted me the way they exploited her. So my friend Kathy, who I knew from Animal Advocacy World, agreed to come on to a webinar, a webcast with me on Skype. And it was the first one I did. It's like, you can go down to like the bottom of my YouTube and you can see my conversation with Kathy. And I loved it. I was just like, oh my gosh, like I can have these conversations about subjects that I'm passionate about for an hour and hear their story and hear about things that I want to learn about. And it was just so inspiring, and thought, well, I could do this. And so I just started learning about how to podcast. I had some mentors, Jose and Mohawk Matt. Couple guys that I was writing back and forth with. They're both broadcasters. And I just decided to do it. And I wanted to do it from the point of view of service as a way to move past trauma. You know, obviously trauma is a big part of my story and part of why I do what I do, and kind of the place where I start from. And I thought, you know, when you're in service to others and you're part of causes that are bigger than yourself, you can really elevate yourself and move past your shit. Like, everyone has shit. We all have trauma. Nobody goes through life unscathed. And so if we can just find things that we're passionate about and find ways to make our world a little bit better, you know, not a lot better. I mean, because, you know, you can't change everything overnight, but just move that needle a little bit. And so that was what I thought. I thought, I'm going to bring people on who are doing something cool to move the needle. I don't know how or where or when or what type of, I don't care if they're famous, they're not famous. I mean, I do want Louis Litt from Suits. Oh my God, I got to have him on. I love that guy. You know, I just wanted people on that were fascinating and would bring people an awareness and an understanding about something that they hadn't thought about. They hadn't seen it like that before. I want people to walk away from my show and go, oh, I never thought about, you know, animals and national security, or I never thought about those command investigations and how you don't get to choose the witnesses, or why you can't record your debrief from your, from your senior leader. I mean, I actually recorded my last one because we did it by phone, and I still have it, and I want to listen to it and make sure, like, what was that feedback like? Did I say the right things? I mean, you know, so just little things like that. And I wanted to be able to hear people's stories and then use those stories to basically further the collective and elevate consciousness.
Well, look, and again, I think that anything tied to service, obviously, you know, has a higher calling, right? Or a better purpose than what, hopefully a better purpose than what the people who are doing it are there for, right? I mean, that's in a nutshell, in theory, why you chose to put on a uniform. Right. There's a bigger service, there's a bigger calling while you're talking about serving dogs or, trafficked youth or whatever it may be. We're just talking about, serving the country and democracy and patriotism and all those other things. So I think that's, unique. And certainly there's a place where a lot of us hope to do something of service or at least give back. And there's a platform there, for people to share that. And I think that's pretty awesome. I mean, we just share, the only thing we're sharing here is your individual story, the guest's individual story, which, I think holds a ton of value, obviously. But, again, I appreciate the fact that you are in this sort of niche spot where not a lot of other people are operating. And that's purely just from a podcasting perspective. I think that's the goal. You got to find a place where not many people are residing and then draw them to it. For any given reason. And that's how you sort of build a foundation. For the Hazard Ground, it's just always been about, nobody would have, in theory, nobody knows Teresa Carpenter's story until they listen to this, right? Like they don't get to hear all the minutiae, and it's in your own words. It's the way you've told it. So it's a first person, account of your story. And I think that's always unique because it's your perspective, not anybody else's. And, I wonder if you will start to pivot more to stories about military people and what they've gone through. I know some of your guests are military, but not all of them, right?
Yeah, I wonder about that too, because as I kind of further go down this road, I do see there's this common theme in a lot of my shows of trauma. And, I'm trying to almost normalize that word, because I think that it sounds so bad and it's so stigmatized. But when you think about it, we all have these struggles in life, and we all have these things that we need to figure out how to work through. And, I'm on a kind of a thread now about command investigations, and are they fair? And I've had a couple people on who are talking about this issue, and I'm going to have a gentleman on Tuesday who's part of a foundation where he helps people who have been traumatized by their investigations. And I really want to dig into that issue, because I think it's central to helping people heal, is if they think that the process was just
flawed,
fair.
Well,
Yeah.
the problem, but here's the problem. Okay. And I'll give you, just Mark's view of the whole thing. The problem is we've become an over-investigated military. Everything requires an investigation, everything.
Yes.
And that is where the problem is, because the more you do it, the more you find loopholes, the more the boundary of the edge gets pushed further and further and further, the more it's, hey, let's just hurry up and do it. We do it too much. So because it's become routine, now we just want to speed the process along. We've become an assembly line of investigations within our service ranks, and it's a problem because we've never actually decided what meets the merit of an actual investigation in people's time that warrants it properly. So, that's problem number one. And why people's investigations and the process is flawed is because we do it so much that now we just want to get it over with.
Yep.
Right? I just want the quickest solution to make this go away, and I don't want to actually figure out if there's a real problem here.
But that's because we don't understand people. We don't take the time. Again, it kind of goes back to to go full circle with what we said about earlier. I was just a number in this MedBoard process. I wasn't an actual person that needed help, that needed someone to talk about my trauma. Like I needed to talk to somebody. I needed therapy or something.
I mean, I struggle. I genuinely struggle with, is it the military's job to fix you when you're broken, or do we need just competent, ready people to be able to be the war fighter? There's a balance there. I don't know.
There is a balance. And I will say that it is not the military's job to give me the care that it's now giving me. I would be quite honest in saying that. Like, I think that the issues that I had started in childhood and were exasperated by things in the adulthood, where I just continued to become re-victimized because I had never healed that original wound. Right.
By that admission, though, like 90% of the military should be in therapy. Well, I mean,
right. But here's the
military would fall under that same sort of thing, myself included. So,
but Mark, we have a disintegration of family. Like this is a societal issue. Like, I just don't know if you're going to get people to join the Navy or not the Navy, but the military that haven't been impacted by traumatic experiences. You're not going to get this ready fighting force that we want, because we don't have strong families in society.
So much, and this, the phone and the computer and everything.
Yes.
Tablet, have changed the dynamics of the youth that are signed up. Again, this is an entirely different.
I know. I'm just saying that I think that it's not the military's job to fix our society and to give people this mental health care that they need. But the problem is that we have broken people in society. So how does the military take care of a broken person and get them to a point where they can at least be ready enough to go to war?
Okay. I think the answer simply is this: vet them strong enough to not let them in, so you don't have to fix them. But once you let them through the door, now is your responsibility to care for the entire soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, whatever it is. You have to do it better. The problem is now, and again, we're in the middle of a recruiting crisis. So please come in. Is now, you're creating problems on the back end that nobody cares about, because, well, we get to brief Congress and we get to brief the media that recruiting crisis solved. We don't care. We don't care that they're overweight. We don't care that they're not smart. We don't care that they're not efficient. We don't care that they, have some sort of trauma or anything else. Just get them in uniform. We'll fix it down the road because it's worked for 275 years. Yeah, that's a bad philosophy.
But really broken people can still do the mission. I mean, that's also the problem.
100%. And there are plenty of people, myself included, who have been diagnosed with PTSD, anxiety, and a whole bunch of other things. They're still highly functional soldiers.
Yeah.
You can go to work every day and do the job. You can still throw me in the middle of a combat zone and I'll be the most effective individual in that room. I don't have any doubt about it. That aside, that doesn't mean that the government isn't responsible to fix some of the things on me that they broke.
Mm-hmm.
So
no, it's a tough issue. It is a balance. And I wish I knew where to strike that balance, because I certainly don't. I can only say that.
I think in your podcast conversations is where you figure that out, right? I've learned so much from people like you, from having conversations with people like you on this show, in understanding people. It's like you talked about, right? Like, who are the people that we're dealing with? I want to try to humanize more of this experience and not, it's not a word here, but robotize what we do, because we're so good and we're so efficient at making the warfighter. And I don't ever think we should slow that portion of it down. But still, there's a human process and a human element that we have disregarded in the last 20 plus years of combat, and we need to bring it back.
Right. Because I can tell you that, like, winning, I mean, you are motivated to do the mission and to do whatever it takes to get the mission done when you believe in your team, and when you feel like you're, like, I always go back to being seen, heard, and valued. When you're on a team where you're seen, heard, and valued, you are loyal. And you will do the mission. And even if it involves doing things that are very, very nefarious in combat, you will do it because you're loyal to that team and to the people around you to get the mission done. And I think that we owe it, you're right, we owe it to our military members to give them the care that they need so that they can do that kind of job. But at the same time, there has to be, like you said, a screening process to where the worst of the worst and the people that really can't handle any kind of pressure, any kind of stress, are perhaps not admitted. I mean, there's definitely times, I'll be honest with you, Mark, where I wondered if I was in that latter category. Like, I thought, well, maybe I'm not at the same level of my peers, because my peers aren't having the struggles with stress that I carry. So I definitely can understand needing that balance and where that would lie. So I agree with you.
I wanted to ask you talked about that whole thing about being valued with, your team members and everything. Is that something you learned in your trials and tribulations on the Nimitz?
Definitely. Oh yeah. It's definitely key to what helped me lead today, was going back to that tour, that very much, make or break kind of tour, and saying, okay, did I help my team members feel seen, heard, and valued? And looking back on it, I think I was just trying to survive, and I think that that's something that I carried with me to this day. And even in the way that I try to lead now, like, for an example, I'm so busy with this exercise that I've got going on, and I'm kind of in a tactical role now, executing a lot of the details of that exercise. But I'm not going to let my team down, and I'm not going to not do the things that I've got to do as a branch head, because that doesn't give them an opportunity to be seen, heard, and valued for the work that they're doing. And so I've definitely tried to continue to sort of keep my pulse on how they're doing and what's going on with them, because I realize that you're not gonna build a good team unless you're involved, and you have to be involved as a leader.
I wanted to touch on one more topic with you. Like most PAOs, my former PAO myself, being outspoken is not something that we're shy about. We talk, we want people to hear what we have to say. Not just when I say we, I mean us in general, but the story that's out there. We that whole journalism, let's shine light where there is darkness kind of deal. Truth will prevail, all that, all those platitudes that have become a relic of a time gone by. You've been very outspoken at the latter part of your military career, almost in certain cases to your own detriment.
Yeah.
Do you regret any of that? The platform you have now is fairly large. Do you, are you worried about the Navy trying to, I don't like the way I want to phrase this. Are you worried about if it may cause more headaches with the military than necessary? Because I think you, like me, it's the same thing. It's like, hey, I have a platform for a living, right? I have a radio show. I'm on TV like I do, and if somebody asks me a question, I'm going to answer it, and you may not like my answer, but what you should generically believe in my heart, even if you don't like my answer, is that that I always have the best interest of the Army, of, in this case, for me, the Georgia National Guard and my country at the forefront. Just because you don't like my answer doesn't mean that I have left those values at the door on a specific question. And so I always find it, it's one of those things where, well, your objectivity of my answer doesn't change what the facts of the scenario are. You know what I'm saying? Like, I just, people's perception of the roles that we play, and I've said this repeatedly, they see people like me sometimes as a threat instead of an advocate. Whereas you can to get your message across if we have a conversation and come to an agreement and understanding about what you want that to be. And that's what PAOs know, messaging, right? What's the message we want to put? What are you comfortable with? What am I comfortable with? What can we say together on the same page to communicate something? But again, I think there's a sense that they see platforms and voices that don't think the way they do, and they see threat.
Agree. And I will say that it is definitely a fine line that I walk, especially as a naval communicator. It would be different if I were just a military member in uniform with a platform. But because I'm a public affairs officer, I'm a communicator, it puts me in a very more, I would say, scrutinized position for having such outspoken views. And it has definitely been an evolution for me to get to the point where I am today. It isn't like someone sees my social media today, they don't know where I started from. They don't know, like, I was told I had to shut down my Hawaii military pets Facebook page because I got a complaint from a pet shop owner because I interacted with him on social media, and he was not happy with the fact that I had cohesive arguments and I was polite and respectful. He just wanted to retaliate, and so he writes my chain of command. I mean, I've had that. I've had other people write my chain of command. I actually save all the emails of people who complained about me. And so sometimes I do sometimes question myself too. So part of, as I'm going through this very therapeutic process is wondering if my past has positioned me to always want to fight. And so I have to look deeply at the things that I take on and say, am I doing this because I'm just naturally geared because of my traumatic experiences to always want to advocate? I did a post about this just recently about how I'm sort of trying to decide the kind of person I want to become, because there's a lot of other people that have public platforms that don't have any controversy to what they do, right? They're, a lot of them are like, let's say a pilot, right? The first female Thunderbird pilot. I don't remember her name, but she's wonderful. She's a public speaker. She gets on and does all this stuff online, and she's very prolific. Or you have a retired one star who writes a book about leadership, right? I'm just using those as examples. Like, they're not controversial. They're just straight stick leadership, motivational advice. Whereas my stuff definitely gears on the side of controversy. And so I have to decide as a, as they say in the UK, a campaigner, as a campaigner, what kind of a campaigner do I want to be? Do I want to be somebody who has a seat at the table, or do I want to be somebody who's throwing stones from the sidelines? And so how do you walk that line where you're pushing for change, but then at the same time, you're not a threat? And I will tell you that is a constant balancing act, because some people will always see you as a threat, and some people will always see you as a hero. And depending on the circumstances, I feel like you could be one or the other, or you could be both. And so as I move forward, I'm just very careful about what battles I take on. And I definitely keep my mental health front and center. And I say to myself, is this worth me taking on? I mean, even right now, like I really want this job to be milestone. I'm like, why is this not a milestone billet? Why is this not an 06 maker? I don't understand that. It's so relevant. And I'm sort of halfway fighting it and halfway not, because I'm almost like, Teresa, you've taken on so many fights in your life. Maybe this is just one you can sit out. And so I'm really, as I get older too, I'm starting to kind of go, okay, I still want to make a difference and I still want to do good work, but I maybe don't have to take fights all the time.
Yeah,
maybe,
that's I've run out of piss and vinegar. Like, when you had it all when you were young, I have less piss and less vinegar.
yeah,
I can barely control at my stage of life. So let's hold on to what we got. But I understand that. I think you learn prudence and you learn judiciousness and not every fight is one that needs to be fought. Right.
No.
Fight the fights you can win, fight the fights that need fighting. And that's where you stand, because I've used this phrase a lot. If everything's an emergency, nothing's an emergency. If everything's a fight with you, then nothing's a fight with anybody. Like, they just look at you. Okay. You get to be ignored after a while. So I certainly understand where you're coming from. I want to ask you a question that I ask a lot of our guests, but I think you'll have a very unique answer. What does Teresa Carpenter tell the 21-year-old, 18-year-old version of Teresa Carpenter now? If you can go back and tell, is it don't get in that first relationship? Is it, maybe start your officer career sooner? What would you tell a younger version of yourself that was entering the Navy?
Stop wasting your time on unhealthy people. I mean, honestly,
solid advice.
There's just so much self-induced drama that I got myself in as a young girl. That, whether it be with friends that I was just constantly having issues with, or men that were not good partners that I was choosing. I would also say, and then calm down, breathe, stop freaking out. I would say those are probably the things I would say. And I'd probably give myself a hug and say, calm the fuck down.
Underrated, to say the least. Look, it's been great to connect with you. I think that
you too, Mark.
I love the concept of stories of service in the podcast, because I think that a big part of this whole experience is being able to connect with other people. And it goes back to what we talk about in the military. If you ask anybody who's left the military, a lot of people tell you what they miss the most. Just miss being around the Joes. I realize that now at an 06 level. I just miss being around soldiers. It sucks not being around soldiers. I hate being around other people of my rank because I don't get along with most of them. That's number one. Number two, I feel like a fish out of water because I know they're all looking at me like, how the hell did this guy get this rank? But also, it's just one of those things where the rubber meets the road is where things happen. And I've always enjoyed being there more than I have. And we all get to a point where we want to be able to make high level decisions, right? Because when we're at the bottom, we're looking up going, those people have no idea what the hell they're talking about. When I get up there and I make these decisions, I know exactly what to do, right? You get that feeling. And I'm guilty of that as well. But, in the same respect, while I embrace the idea of making tough decisions and being the one in the chair who gets to make those calls, still being at the ground level with the people, to me, is the dynamic of the military that will always strike me as my favorite.
Me too. And it's probably why I've always chosen these operational, tactical-ish jobs, is because I just want to be where the rubber meets the road. And, nothing against the people in the ivory towers that do those kinds of jobs. I don't think that's really where my sweet spot is. My sweet spot is going on the trips and seeing in action. Like this weekend, I'm going to Faroe Islands and gonna do a day at sea on a Danish ship. So I think it's gonna be pretty exciting. And I think it's definitely an honor to do this work. And you're right, you have such a different perspective on it when you're at the top of the ranks that you looked up at as a child or a young woman and gone, oh my gosh, like it's so different being on this side of it. You had no idea the kind of stress and issues that you would be dealing with as a leader. Because as a follower, you're just like, why are they making this decision? Why are they doing this? I don't understand. And then you get to this point, and you're like, whoa, they got a lot of shit on their plate. They got a lot of other things to consider.
Yeah.
They got a lot of, it's
not
definitely
just the complaints that they have to worry about, right? Yeah.
Yes. So
or for me to be misled by the fact that I'm not the most important person in the universe. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
They can get Stories of Service anywhere they get podcasts, correct?
Absolutely. You can just put in SOS, S period, O period, S period, and then you put my name, Theresa, Theresa Carpenter. You can find me on LinkedIn, Facebook. I'm on Instagram, anywhere you do your socials. I've got 84 episodes, been going on for 2 years now. And I'm very happy with it and honored that people continue to agree to come on. So I'll just keep on doing it for as long as it stays fun. And I feel like it's providing a service. I mean, this is my way of giving back. So yeah.
Continued success with the podcast. Again, reach out to her on LinkedIn. That's my suggestion. That's where all your good stuff is.
Yes.
And follow the podcast as well. Continued luck and success with the rest of the actual in uniform part of your career, and wherever that may take you. And enjoy NATO and all the foreigners and everything else, and that stuff that's going on over there. Do us all a favor, okay? But let's find a more peaceful world. Amen. Look, more platitudes. So I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you taking time away from your schedule. So it's been great to get to know you. But Theresa Carpenter, thanks for being part of the Hazard Ground.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. Thanks so much for having me.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground podcast, hosted by Mark Zinno. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at producer@hazardground.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.